All right, welcome in, folks. It's noon on the dot, so we'll, as always, allow for time as folks transition from one Zoom meeting to the next, or maybe heating up a little bit of lunch here to enjoy while they listen to our presentation to filter in. But as always, we'll introduce ourselves and sort of the topic for discussion today before diving into the meat of the topic here. But always want to start with a land acknowledgement. And I'm just really struck recently in my readings. I've been reminded not only about the thoughtful stewardship and harmony with which the Alaska Native peoples have lived on these lands for time immemorial, but I've also been struck by the innovative ways that they built and designed their lodgings and structured their lifestyles in a way that was super mindful of the energy that they had and also the importance of conserving that energy. And so, as as REAP and Tanana Chiefs Conference and others advocate for the accelerated development of not only renewable energy, but also specifically energy efficiency across Alaska, and perhaps through specific means, such as the ones we'll discuss today, we're really just mindful of and proud to follow the lead of generations of indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands for generations and whose approach we seek to emulate as we build a just transition to a renewably fueled sustainable future for all Alaskans. So really wanted to ground us in that as we discuss green banks and solar for all today. Also wanted to start with a quick logistical note, and attendees are encouraged to introduce themselves using the chat function here. We'll also be logging your questions using the Q&A function. So hopefully as those strike you, you can put those there and I'll be monitoring those for the Q&A at the end. That brings me to just the timing that we have here. This is an hour-long webinar. We'll begin, as I mentioned, with introductions. We'll have about 40 minutes for discussion between our two expert panelists today before we open it up to 10 or 15 minutes or so at the end for audience Q&A. In order to ensure that I don't miss your important questions, please remember to use that Q&A function. And then I'll also start by answering one of the more popular questions. This is being recorded, and so no need to take detailed notes today. We'll have this recording available on the REAP YouTube channel, if not this afternoon, early tomorrow morning. So on that note, I'll go ahead and get us started by just giving a brief introduction to REAP before I ask our moderators and speakers, our speakers to jump into the discussion here today. So Renewable Energy Alaska Project, or REAP, is a statewide nonprofit organization dedicated to the mission of increasing the development of renewable energy and energy efficiency, sort of what we refer to together as clean energy here in Alaska through collaboration, education, training, and advocacy. We're a member-based organization. Our diverse coalition of over 60 dues-paying members is comprised of renewable energy developers, businesses, conservation and consumer groups, electric utilities, Alaska Native entities, local governments, and educational institutions. So really just a broad coalition of energy stakeholders who share that vision, that mission, and are really aligned around action to achieve the goals that we've set out as an organization. A big part of REAP's work, as I mentioned, is the advocacy for ideas and policies that help to achieve that mission. So we're really excited today to talk about one in particular, and then also just a broader context and sort of other opportunities that sort of dovetail nicely with that effort towards REAP's mission. We're also fortunate to have REAP's founder and executive director, Chris Rose, here today. So any questions about REAP can be directed to him. He's been doing this for almost 2 decades now, and so he's obviously the authority on the group as well. But also wanted to introduce our other speaker here, Dave Messier. He currently serves as the Infrastructure Division Director for Tanana Chiefs Conference, overseeing their energy, broadband, and housing programs. Dave has been working on rural energy and infrastructure needs in interior communities since 2009. He holds a Bachelor of Science from Cornell University and an MBA from UAF, and since 2017 has served as a board member on the Golden Valley Electric Association Board of Directors. Through his consulting business, Daylight Energy Services, Dave has also led the design, engineering, and procurement for all of the currently operational high-penetration solar battery diesel projects in the Northwest Arctic Borough. That's in Noatak, Shungnak, and Kotzebue. And recently, he supplied and installed the 864 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion-based grid bridging system in Stebbins, Alaska. So pretty awesome to have both of these true energy experts here for this panel today. As I mentioned, the title of it is Green Banks and Solar for All. Really hoping to just really provide an update on state efforts to pass legislation which would establish a green bank for the state here as well. And then, as I mentioned, other contextual opportunities to try and bring perhaps some federal funding, and then also really leverage some private investment to scale out the benefits that would provide for Alaskans here at home. But you're not here for me, you're here for our esteemed speakers here today. So I'll hand it off to Chris Rose to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Donovan, and welcome everybody. It's nice to see so many folks on the call today. As Donovan mentioned, we're going to do a little bit of an update on what's going on with green bank legislation here in the state, but also some national updates. And then we'll flow into a more focused update on the Solar for All competition that is part of the Greenhouse Gas Initiative from the federal government. So on the green bank, those of you who've been following this for a while, I think understand what a green bank is, but for those of you who may not understand what a green bank is, I'll give you a real short synopsis of what we've been trying to achieve for several years now, which is bring affordable financing to people who want to put energy efficiency and renewable energy on their buildings and make their buildings more efficient and more self-reliant. This work really sprang out a lot of from the highly successful Alaska Housing Finance Corporation energy efficiency, weatherization, and rebate programs that were grant funded. And when those grants started to wane several years ago, we started to search around the country for alternatives to making energy efficiency happen and came upon green banks. And for the longest time now, it seems, we've been working closely with other green bank partners, particularly the Connecticut Green Bank, which is the first green bank in the country and also the most successful in terms of the amount of clean energy financing that they're doing every year. They're actually doing hundreds of millions of dollars of clean energy financing in Connecticut every year now. And they have really pioneered what I would describe as an entity that typically has some kind of a state nexus. In Connecticut, it was legislated, a green bank by the state legislature that develops programs and products that will allow people to get affordable loans to do energy efficiency and rooftop solar in particular. So in Connecticut, and what we're trying to do here in the state of Alaska is establish an entity that does a lot of the upfront hard work of actually figuring out what are the best kinds of programs to serve, in this case, Alaskans, and what are the loan products that would actually be developed that we can use to not only provide affordable loans, but to entice the private sector into developing or putting a lot of the money into those developments. We are not really focused on trying to have the state of Alaska do all the financing for all the clean energy projects we need to develop here in the state of Alaska, but rather what we are working to do and what the federal legislation that recently passed is designed to do is leverage private investment. And one of the ways that I try to describe what's going on is to provide the analogy of automobiles. When automobiles were first invented 100 or so years ago, you couldn't just run out that day and get an automobile loan. It took a while for the private sector investment community, i.e. the banks, to figure out what the risk profile of a car was. And of course, over time, they began to loan on cars. And now it's to the point where you can get a zero interest loan on a product that depreciates the moment you drive it off the parking lot. And yet today, it's still very difficult for people, even with good credit, to get an affordable loan to do things like make their house more efficient or to put up solar panels on their house. When I tried to get my own solar project built a few years ago, I went to my credit union and I was offered a 10% loan and a 5-year payback. So an example, that's not a very good loan for me. It's a pretty high interest rate and it's a quick payback. So a good example of how a green bank might redesign a loan would be to give me a 5% loan and maybe give me 10 or 15 years to pay that back. So it's not a cash flow burden for me. And in fact, on energy efficiency loans that we've seen other green banks offer, typically they are designed so that the savings a person gets every month from the energy efficiency upgrade that they do to their home actually equals or is even greater than their payback, their monthly loan payment. So that's what a green bank does. A few years ago, the Governor Dunleavy, introduced a bill that would have established the Alaska Energy Independence Fund. and that fund was going to be housed at Ada. And we got that bill almost to the finish line after 2 years, but ultimately it failed because there was a lot of concern about housing that entity at Ada. So in the summer of 2022, we worked closely with HFC and the governor's office and got the bill rewritten and reintroduced in 2023 this spring by the governor again, now moving that entity from Ada to HFC. So as the bill is written now, it would be a state green bank, still called the Alaska Energy Independence Fund, but housed at the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Because the bill made it through multiple committees in the first go round, the bill was only assigned a few committees last spring when it was reintroduced in April. So it was assigned to just 2 committees on the House side, the House Energy and the House Finance Committee, and just 1 committee on the Senate side. The bill passed the House Energy Committee almost immediately after it was introduced in April and is now sitting in House Finance. It's also sitting in Senate Finance, which means that we are getting pretty close to the finish line for getting a state green bank established. And I will give you folks the numbers so that you have them handy. And I know we have all this information on our website too, but it's House Bill 154 and Senate Bill 125. House Bill 154 and Senate Bill 125. So please tell your respective representatives to support that legislation. If that legislation is passed, what HFC will do is begin, like I said before, the hard work of developing loan programs and loan products to support affordable loans for buildings in particular. The language in the bill says that the priority of the Alaska Energy Independence Fund shall be energy efficiency and renewable energy for residential, commercial, and community buildings. So even though ultimately the Alaska Green Bank could finance other kinds of projects, perhaps renewable energy generation projects, that's not really the focus. The priority is energy efficiency and renewable energy, primarily rooftop solar for buildings. And this really would be a perfect fit with all the other federal incentives that now exist for particularly things like rooftop solar and heat pumps. I will close by just giving folks a brief overview of what's going on nationally and then hand it over to Dave. But when we first started promoting the idea of a state green bank in Juneau, what we were saying to legislators is, if we can develop a state green bank, we will ultimately be able to get money from a federal green bank because there's federal green bank legislation in play. And at that time, the federal green bank bill, which was to develop a national climate bank, had actually passed the House of Representatives in Congress a couple of times. And in fact, the late Representative Young was one of the few Republicans in the House that was a co-sponsor of that bill, but it never passed the Senate. And so the National Green Bank bill was having some trouble getting through Congress, and it eventually then got put into the Inflation Reduction Act. So what happened was in August of 2022, when the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, there was a whole section that created the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is a $27 billion program that consists of three different pots of money. One is the Solar for All that has already been that Dave's going to talk about, and that has already gone through its RFP process. And then the other two, that was $7 billion. The other two are the National Clean Investment Fund, or NCIF, and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, or the CCIA. I know those are just acronyms, but it is sometimes difficult to keep these things straight. Those have also just recently gone through their RFP processes. Those two, the National Clean Investment Fund and the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator, are really developing what I would describe more as national and regional green banks. The National Clean Investment Fund will be dedicated to low-income and disadvantaged communities. At least 40% of those funds have to go to those types of disadvantaged communities, but there's only going to be 2 or 3 of those awards. That's going to be $14 billion that's going to go to 2 or 3 different national entities. The Clean Communities Investments Accelerator is probably going to go to more like 2 to 7 hub nonprofit organizations that will also in turn be supporting local community lenders. But the idea of both of these funds is that they will be providing monies that will go to entities like a state green bank. And those monies can go both to helping to get started and operate a state green bank or similar institution, and also to capitalize them. So those two entities, when they get awarded, and we are now understanding that those awards are probably going to come out of EPA sometime in March. When those new entities are formed, those are the kinds of entities that a state green bank that might be housed at HFC would want to partner with, so that they can develop more programs with the federal money than we would be able to do just with the state money that we hope the state legislature will appropriate. And then last but not least, the Solar for All competition, which just ended not very long ago. That's a $7 billion fund. So again, 6, 14, and 7 billion, all equal to $27 billion. The Solar for All competition is really focused just on solar, and HFC and AEA teamed up to apply for $100 million that would be split between those two entities. If they are awarded the $100 million, $50 million would go toward Alaska Energy Authority and be focused more on community sized solar projects. And then the other $50 million would go to HFC and would be more for rooftop solar projects. So right in the groove that HFC would already want to be getting into, if they are able to develop a green bank, they would be really doing more retail projects on buildings. And so that application went in, AEA and HFC together. I think there is a very strong chance that will be awarded. And at the same time, there was a separate competition that allowed for tribal organizations and other entities to apply for Solar for All, and Tanana Chiefs did their own application. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dave so he can talk a little bit more specifically about the Solar for All program and the application that TCC put in. So thanks a lot.
Cool. Thanks, Chris. And hopefully you guys can all hear me okay. Donovan just contacted me, I think, on Friday last week. So I'm kind of the B team because nobody from AHFC was available. So don't take it too hard if I don't do a good job. But I've been on the REAP board for, almost the last, 10 or 12 years or so. And I'm just a huge fan of all the work that REAP does and how hard Mr. Rose works to make sure that our state has access to clean, hopefully affordable energy. And in the TCC region, as folks who may not be familiar with the region know, we are the center of the state. So we're a giant swath. I like to say we're about the size of the state of Texas if you cut off the panhandle, fewer miles of road than the state of Rhode Island. And if you were to turn all of our diesel generators on in our remote communities, it'd be probably about the load of the Atwood building, or at least the design load of the Atwood building, would be about 10 megs tops down in Anchorage. So very dispersed, fairly small population, very spread out. And many of our communities are dependent on imported diesel for almost 100% of their generation. And so Tanana Chiefs Conference, about 10 or 12 years ago or so, said, hey, this doesn't really make sense. This isn't really tribal security, tribal energy sovereignty. We need an energy program to try to assist our communities in reducing their dependence on imported diesel. And so working for another entity at the time, I was actually kind of fresh out of college, and I was put in charge of a hydrokinetic project in Ruby, Alaska. Some of the folks on the call might be familiar with. And we spent a few years and almost $500,000 trying to make electricity out of what we jokingly referred to a giant egg beater in the middle of the Yukon River. And about that time, I put in my first solar array down in Tanana, and we produced more electricity in the first month than we had in the last 2 or 3 years of monkeying around with the in-river turbine. And that system is a 4.4 kW system down in Tanana. I have not been down there to work on it since we put it in, and it is still generating electricity. And that is when I kind of fell in love with solar and realized this is a perfectly good fit for our communities and a very good fit for rural Alaska because it's fairly low maintenance. And so as we started going through working with our communities, the program initially kind of focused on more of the residential small grid tied systems. doing 18 kW systems to offset energy consumption in village council buildings. We started coupling them with small batteries, and we kind of progressed over the last few years doing progressively larger systems. I would say in 2017, we got funded for a system in Hughes, Alaska. And we said, well, the model here kind of works, right? We're producing electricity, it's offsetting diesel consumption. We just need to do it in a bigger scale. And so we piloted a project up in Hughes, a 120 kW solar project with a 353 kilowatt hour battery energy storage system. It took us a few years to get it up and running, but long story short, we were able to run this last year for periods of 12 hours in the Alaska summer, diesel's off. And as we went through the process on that project, not only did we learn a heck of a lot, but we realized, man, this is a phenomenal fit for remote communities because there's no moving parts on the energy generation side of things. And the technology is so robust and fairly straightforward. And so we've been kind of working the kinks out with other systems. And I'm very happy to see that the concept has really taken off in a number of other places. I've been a part of different projects through my consulting hat. But in the TCC region, we've got applications in for a bunch of different systems, totaling upwards of, I would say, $50 or so million in competitive applications. And then the Solar for All opportunity came up, and we said, well, this is a huge opportunity for a tribal entity to really take the lead on trying to bring more of these federal dollars into the state. You guys, I'm sure everybody has heard of all the billions of dollars that have been allocated. Well, a lot of that money is not just going to come to your state unless you work for it. So there's got to be nonprofit entities. The state of Alaska through the Alaska Energy Authority or Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, those entities have to put in competitive applications and compete for those funds. Similarly, on the tribal side, Tanana Chiefs Conference is roughly a $250 million a year tribal healthcare organization. We were originally founded as kind of the nonprofit self-governance arm for the interior, and we morphed into predominantly tribal healthcare because there's funding for that, but always have had kind of a self-governance role in assisting our tribes. And so it was an easy fit. And quite frankly, we have a solid enough balance sheet based on our operations budget to go after some of these bigger pots of money that some other tribal organizations and tribes don't have the financial audited statements for, or just don't have the size for. So the Solar for All application that TCC had submitted, it was $100 million. And why did we ask for $100 million? Well, that's as much as we could ask for, because we believe these are good projects that save money for many years down the road, and more importantly in our areas, offset diesel. And as Chris alluded to, I would say we kind of piggybacked. We had sent in a letter of support and were somewhat involved in the AEA AHFC application, but those guys had everything under control, and it was a phenomenal model of different organizations within the state coming together to try to bring those federal dollars home to Alaska to make sure that they were creating benefit for Alaskan entities in the long term. And we said, that seems like a good model. We worked with our partners at Alaska Native Tribal Healthcare Health Consortia and Alaska Housing Finance Corporation to craft this $100 million application, which is split into three parts. There's $50 million, and I should note that the Solar for All program is a little bit unique in that it's not aimed at funding particular projects. It is aimed at setting up programs. And so Chris alluded to the programs that AEA and AHFC are going to set up. It's a little bit different for us because we're used to going after project funds, but the development of the program is what the EPA was interested in. And so we had submitted a $100 million application. In that application, we had said, well, $50 million will go to Alaska Native Tribal Healthcare Consortia to kind of create a similar program to what the Alaska Energy Authority proposed to do with the $50 million that they went after through the state application. And so that's of that $100 million, ANTHC will get $50 million to craft a program to get more of these high penetration solar diesel systems out. And then Alaska Housing Finance Corporation would receive about $12.5 million specifically to aim at rooftop solar for low-income Native families along the rail belt. And then with the remaining $37.5 million, Tanana Chiefs Conference stood up and said, well, we will start a program as well, but we wanted to try to impact as many Native families across the state as we could. And we kind of realized that with all the focus on rural Alaska, because that's where the high energy costs are, there's still a tremendous amount of needy Native families on the rail belt. And so our focus for that $37.5 million is to create kind of a model for community solar projects in the 1 to 5 megawatt range, with tribal entities owning them up and down the Alaska rail belt. So hopefully we'll have one here in the Fairbanks area. Hopefully there'll be one down in South Central and potentially one down in the Kenai. And those entities will either have a community solar set up, depending on where the legislation sits and what tariff can be approved by the Regulatory Commission of Alaska. But if not, well, what we learned from working with Golden Valley Electric Association up here in Fairbanks is that they have an existing tariff that we could sell electricity onto. And that's kind of the model. We're calling it community solar, but essentially Tanana Chiefs Conference would be the independent power producer, the IPP, and we would have a power producer, a PPA set up with Golden Valley where we're selling them electricity. And then we would take the revenue generated from the sale of that electricity and spread it across some of our native families in the interior that are on the Golden Valley Electric Association grid, very similar to a community solar setup. The difference being there's not like it's not quite a 1-for-1 value. The cost of a kilowatt hour on the Golden Valley grid is about 26 cents currently. The avoided cost for fuel that we would be paid is somewhere between 8 and 12 cents. And so it would just be that 8 to 12 cents that we focus on, which is still, people say, man, that's a bad deal. And I don't argue with that. It could certainly be better. And I also like to point out that that's the avoided cost of some of these community solar type projects in the lower 48. That's their total cost per kilowatt hour. And so even if we can get a partial cost per kilowatt hour, it is still a step in the right direction as we wait for some hopeful legislation that allows for community solar setup. So that's a high level overview of what the Tanana Chiefs Conference Solar for All grant application was. We put that in. Geez, there's been so many grant opportunities that we've responded to, but I think that one went in September or early October. And hopefully by this next spring, we'll kind of get a notice of award. We feel strongly we had a good application. And then I'm hoping that we'll be able to set up the program and start to get some solar installed by 2025 if all goes according to plan. But that's an overview of the TCC Solar for All application.
Great. Yeah. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's sort of an awesome opportunity with existing legislation that we're hoping to pass here, and then these contextual funding opportunities to try and really scale out the impact that a green bank might have in Alaska. And I know you sort of alluded to it, Chris, but a big also potential benefit of green banks that a green bank would bring to Alaska that we've seen elsewhere is really trying to leverage more private investment to scale out the sort of impact that the product and programmatic offerings a green bank might have in terms of energy efficiency or perhaps rooftop solar installations. So would you mind speaking to just a bit more of the benefit that has been seen by leveraging private investment elsewhere that has green banks, Chris?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the primary goals of a green bank is to leverage as much private support as possible for these kinds of projects. Just as we talked a little bit earlier about how it took so long for the banks to understand how cars worked and what the risk profile of cars is. Today, we are still seeing the private banking community not quite understanding the business model for solar panels or for energy efficiency. And so one of the things that HFC can and will do, I hope, as a green bank, is work with all the private sector lenders that are interested in the state and educate them on how it is a good thing for them to be financing energy efficiency and renewable energy. In other words, give them a whole new line of business that they don't really understand as well as they might today. So that's the way it works in places like Connecticut. The Connecticut Green Bank has worked very closely with private sector lenders there, to the point where in many of the programs that the Connecticut Green Bank has developed, the private sector might be putting in $4, $5, $6 for every $1 that the Connecticut Green Bank puts in. That's called a leverage ratio. So for every $1 the Green Bank puts in, how many dollars can you get from the private sector? And in fact, there is one energy efficiency loan program that Connecticut runs that has a 9-to-1 leverage ratio. So that means that for every dollar that goes into a project through that program, 90 cents is coming from the private sector banks, and only a dime is coming from the Connecticut Green Bank. Obviously, that allows the state money, which is usually more scarce, to be leveraged and have a bigger impact than it would that if the state green bank had to put in all the money. My understanding of the parameters of the Solar for All project that HFC and AEA put in is that there's a lot of flexibility for AEA and HFC if they get that money for how they lend it out. For instance, they could lend it out at 0%. They could lend it out at 5%. They could even grant part of it. But clearly, if you put more of it into loans, then those loans get paid back and are recycled and allow for a lot more people to be positively impacted.
Thanks. And just maybe also to give a sense for, you mentioned loans and then also loan products. Would you mind just perhaps giving an example maybe of like a loan loss reserve fund or some sort of product, just to give folks an idea for the various offerings that a green bank might have?
Well, what a green bank does really here is reduce the risk of a loan as it's perceived by a private sector lender. And so if you want, for instance, First National Bank of Alaska to be involved in a green bank transaction in Alaska, you might say, look, we know that you're not sure about this FNBA, but what we're going to do is we're going to mitigate your risk. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that. One of the ones you just suggested is a loan loss reserve fund, which is just a pot of money that the green bank sets aside, almost like an escrow. And that money is there for a certain percentage of losses that might be incurred by a private sector bank. So it's a way to incentivize a private sector lender into a transaction that they might otherwise be a little bit scared of. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that the default rate on these kinds of loans historically at places like the Connecticut Green Bank have been super, super low. And so I think that the history, at least in other states, of green banks successfully lending without default is another way for us to like be educating the public, or excuse me, the private banks here in the state of Alaska. I guess another thing that's worth mentioning that a green bank does is it builds up enough of these loans in a market. Let's just say this is the Alaska market, where eventually those loans can be packaged and resold. Okay, that is common in the banking community. When you get a loan for a car or a house, you're not surprised to get a letter sometime down the road from your lender that says, hey, we just sold your loan. That's common practice. So you can't do that unless you build up enough of a bank of those kinds of loans to package them and sell them off. But that's important because once a lender can get those loans off their balance sheet, then they're free to start doing more loans to the next group of people. So basically that's warehousing those loans. That's another function of a green bank that we hope to provide through something like the Alaska Energy Independence Fund that is being proposed at HFC.
Awesome. And I'm saying I'll just make a plug for more questions, even though we've got a lot here, and some of them sort of align with questions that I was planning on asking anyway. So I'll try and take them in the order that I think makes most sense with the conversation. And one here from Mark Stevenson, just on that point about sort of the leverage ratio that we've seen with private investors. I'll just read it out here. He said, in Connecticut, where the private investors are putting in 90 cents on the dollar, how are they de-risking their investments? Are they placing liens on the property perhaps? And sort of while I let that hang there for a second, that makes me think about CPACE and CPACER as it's evolved here in Anchorage. And there are a number of questions here I know from conversations with other REIT members. There's a big effort to try and bring CPACER to the Kenai Peninsula. And there's a number of questions here just about how would a green bank interface with CPACER as well. So sort of want to, maybe we could take those together. That the placing the liens on the property makes me think of the ways that CPACE loans are structured as well. But any thoughts on how the private?
Yeah, I mean, in the particular question, the reason why that residential energy efficiency loan program has so much private participation is that the loans themselves have been structured to be basically cash flow neutral or cash flow positive for the borrower. So the borrower is saving at least as much money every month as their loan payment. So that de-risks the loan quite a bit. The person right now is paying a hefty heating bill. they get a loan to change their furnace, all of a sudden they're saving a bunch of money every month on their heating bill. And if the loan is structured such that the loan payment is equal to or less than the savings, then it's not a very risky loan for the bank, because that person is just diverting that money that they have every month already from a heating bill to a loan repayment. And then eventually, when they pay for that loan, when they pay that loan off, they're just pocketing that savings every month. But in that particular case, the loan loss reserve fund is also a mechanism that the Green Bank is deployed to attract more private sector banks. As far as CPACE goes, one of the things that a Green Bank could do, and the bill in the legislature is written such that this could happen, is that CPACE programs could opt in to having the Green Bank be the administrator for those CPACE programs. Because right now, one of the problems we're running into is that the Anchorage municipality has developed a CPACE program, and immediately or pretty soon thereafter, Matsu Borough approved one by ordinance. But then the Matsu Borough asked the city of Anchorage, will you help us administer this program? Because these are all such relatively small programs, it's hard to find the personnel to administrate them. And it makes way more sense for one entity like a Green Bank to be administering all those CPACE programs. So eventually what could happen is the CPACE programs in the state could all opt into having another entity like the Green Bank be the administrator. And of course, in places where there is no property tax, where you can't have a CPACE program, which is a lot of rural Alaska, ultimately a Green Bank could be a lender in those markets for commercial buildings where a CPACE program is not possible.
Thanks. And then, so there's another question here that sort of I might combine with another question that I would have for you, Dave. And so Eric McCallum asks, well, all these solar projects need to include US made solar panels, racking inverters, that sort of requirement, just due to the fact that some of this, this funding through Solar for All is federal funding. And it sort of also brings to mind for me questions around, I'm not sure if there's matching fund requirements for things through the Solar for All program. I know that's been sort of giving folks heartburn in communities here in Alaska. So I'm just curious about the sort of requirements that come with this sort of funding that comes through Solar for All.
Yeah, those are great questions, and we are still analyzing the answers to them on the Buy America aspects of the system specifically. That's always our goal, is to buy American-made products. It's really kind of a numbers game. Our overall goal is how much solar can we get installed, because we know that's going to be providing electricity reliably for at least 20-25 years. And then it's kind of a mixing, matching game of what are the specific incentives that I'll be eligible for on the tax credit side? What does the grant require me to spend? And typically they'll look at the entire system, and I've heard different percentages of the entire system that need to meet the Made in America. Sometimes it's 30% of the entire system that needs to be made in America. So if you get American-made steel, American-made racking, American-made inverters, you might be able to import your panels if not all of the components of the panel were made in America. So there's a lot of nuance there, and we have a tax advisor on board because some of those are in the grant requirements. And then to your point, Donovan, some of them are in the tax credit requirements. If you want to rely on some of the direct pay benefits that were instigated in the Inflation Reduction Act, or I should say kind of brought back and then put on steroids, as I like to say, through the Inflation Reduction Act, you need to meet certain Buy America provisions. And then there's other grant funding opportunities we have access to where there's tribal kind of exceptions. So the tribe could potentially get around some of the Made in America. So there's not an easy answer to that question. The short answer is we're still looking into it, and it's probably going to be a project by project kind of call. But on the whole, yeah, a lot of the components are going to have to be made in America. Now, to the matching side of things, for folks who haven't been following the somewhat convoluted changes to the tax code, the direct pay incentives were really kind of earth-shattering when they put them into the Inflation Reduction Act, and they make projects much easier to fund. And more importantly, especially for Alaska, where we've got a high percentage of nonprofits and tribes looking to do these sorts of projects, those entities don't typically have a federal tax liability. Sometimes those entities, like Tanana Chiefs Conference, doesn't actually file a federal income tax return because we don't have to. We're a 501c3. So we're still combing through the different requirements, but again, our goal is to try to make these systems as large as possible and to leverage everything that we can. So we're a little bit unique because we have such a strong, healthy balance sheet. We have the leadership at TCC has set up a $5 million revolving loan fund. And the purpose of that is so that as the infrastructure program, my program goes after these different federal grants, we can kind of borrow money from that revolving loan fund, knowing that once these systems are placed in service, because our model is that TCC is the operator of most of the systems that we're putting in long term, so we can assure that the systems operate reliably and we can take advantage of the tax credits. After we place the systems in service, we'll file the tax credit paperwork, get reimbursed, and then we can replenish that fund. And so hopefully it'll be revenue neutral to TCC over the long term, but in the short term, they'll be able to kind of loan the program and the project up to $5 million. And so there's a variety of different ways we're trying to get creative to assist our tribes in making sure that they're leveraging everything that they can to ensure that they've got a bigger project, because that drives the cost per watt down. And again, these systems are going to be producing electricity for hopefully the next 20 years. And then not to go too far into the weeds and the minutia, but if you look at the tax credit opportunities, you can't make money on the use of the tax credit, right? But you can easily get 30 to 70% if you stack everything right. We're targeting kind of the 40 to 50% range. So like if we get a grant for a couple $1 million, we can increase the size of that project that we have a grant for, use some of our own matching funds, and the entire project cost, say it's $4 million instead of $2 million. Well, if we have a 50% tax credit and a $2 million grant, we fund a project that, you know, costs $4 million for us to put in, file the tax paperwork, and we get our upfront investment repaid. So we're trying to, you know, as I said, maximize all of our opportunities, and it's definitely a new game for us to be in, but we're trying to bring those resources to bear for our tribes. And from that standpoint, we've realized that we kind of have to lead and make sure that hopefully there's people behind us that are following.
I think Dave's point about using the tax credits is really important to make, and it applies to all the residential tax credits that are available and the residential loan programs that we hope a green bank will develop. Because if you want to put solar on your house today and take advantage of the 30% tax credit, you can't do it unless you've got the upfront capital. And so if you are able to borrow that money from a green bank, it really increases your internal rate of return quite a bit if you can get a tax credit on borrowed money. And so, you know, there is a way for a lot of these programs to interact. The same goes for some of the credits and rebates that are available federally for things like heat pumps. If you can borrow that money up front from a green bank, it really helps these projects move forward much faster. One of the things that is going to be, I think, a roadblock or a barrier for getting these projects done is just making sure that we've got the people in Alaska and nationwide to do the kinds of projects that we want to get done. So there is money in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund too that can go through the funds that I mentioned before that are now being competed for things like technical assistance and maybe even training. And a lot of that's going to be worked out, I think, between the entities that apply and the EPA eventually. But I think that there's an acknowledgement in the federal law that you can't just throw money at this stuff. We are also going to have to really develop the workforce and the capacity locally to build projects and maintain them. And so that's going to also be an opportunity, I think, in Alaska as we see these projects or these programs funded by EPA. We really hope that our local entities will be partnering with those new entities that get funded.
Thanks. And that I think you sort of answered another question that we had here from the group, which was just, will the green bank be just for solar, or will it be eligible for envelope upgrades and heat pumps? So it sort of brings me to another question that I was going to ask, just to sort of like ground us in the expertise of the institution where it would be housed as the legislation is currently written, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Would either of you, maybe Chris, just speak to also the track record that Alaska Housing Finance Corporation has with these sorts of programs, and just the sort of like the expertise and then the speed with which you anticipate they'll be able to stand up programs that really sort of accelerate projects like envelope upgrades or just home energy retrofits that are sort of like the launching point for a green bank in Alaska?
Yeah, the statutory language says that the primary focus of the new green bank is energy efficiency and renewable energy for residential, commercial, and community buildings. Okay, so that's the priority. It doesn't mean that the green bank can't fund other things, but it really is going to be focused on buildings. And as you mentioned, HFC has a strong track record administering both the weatherization and the rebate programs. More than $640 million was appropriated to HFC for those programs starting in about 2008. More than 50,000 residential buildings have been weatherized. The average savings has been over 30% on people's heating bills. So HFC not only has lending experience through their mortgage loan program, but also has great experience administering energy efficiency and understanding how you actually measure energy efficiency before and after an upgrade. So I think there's going to be a tremendous opportunity for us to be weatherizing buildings. And certainly there's not a priority of energy efficiency first and solar second necessarily, but both of those things are going to be opportunities under the green bank legislation.
And I think I know from prior conversations with folks about green bank legislation as it's been going through this process, there's also been questions regarding how much of these products and programs would be focused on urban Alaska versus rural Alaska. And I'm sort of curious, either Chris or also Dave, just your perspectives on the quickest way that we can make sure that all Alaskans benefit from this opportunity. And then also, I think maybe just to hammer home what you were alluding to, or what you were, explicitly talking about earlier, Dave, in terms of perhaps there's tribal entities like TCC, but who haven't maybe created this revolving loan fund, and sort of the opportunity to scale out their ability to take advantage of these sort of federal like matching and tax incentives, and then sort of the ability to cover their short-term costs and sort of their cash flow that would come from loan programs through a state green bank. If that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Oh, go for it, Chris.
I'll just kind of quickly address it and then let Dave kind of finish, because that is a great example of why you have different kinds of programs. Because, for instance, if you're going to develop a program for weatherization, you are not necessarily going to be able to target that program at everybody in the state of Alaska with one program. You're probably going to be developing a program for urban Alaska, or for commercial buildings, or for residential buildings, or for rural Alaska. This is a great example of why what we're talking about when we talk about different programs. So there might be a solar program. There might even be a low-income solar program. There might be a rural solar program. Each of these programs is going to have to be tailored to whoever is going to be receiving the benefits. And so I just wanted to mention that. That's when we talk about products, we're actually talking about the actual loan product. What does that product look like? What are the terms of that product? In other words, what are the interest rate terms? What are the payback terms? Those kinds of things. So that's what we mean by programs and products. It appears to me that, if HFC becomes the green bank, they're going to have tailored programs. They're going to be focused in different places. But if they get federal money, depending on which of these different streams of EPA funding comes through the state, they will be required to spend a certain amount of those funds either on low income or disadvantaged communities. So it's going to get a little bit complicated to administer depending on where the source of the dollars comes from. But right now, the state money is not necessarily requiring a certain percentage to go one way or the other.
And I would just add to that, for folks who have, rural Alaska is kind of our backyard, right? And at TCC, it's where we live and work every day. And to some extent, the concept of of energy justice or energy equity is a little bit foreign. We had to kind of wrap our head around it because it's like, wait a second, that's just what we do. That's our job. It's just got this new fancy name now. But when it comes to financing instruments out in rural Alaska, I think probably the previous HFC weatherization program is a good example of why there's just differences out there between rural and urban Alaska. And they're not insignificant. And a lot of those relate to how rural Alaska is financed. And quite frankly, there's certain areas of rural Alaska, like in Southeast, that are much further ahead, I would say, and as far as financial education and just how buildings are getting constructed. But the idea of taking out a loan on your home in many of the communities I represent is kind of a foreign concept. Whereas down in Wasilla, Anchorage, just what everybody does. That's how you get a home. In some areas of my world, it's you're waiting sometimes years and years for a local housing authority to build you a home that you get, and it's based on your income, what you have to pay. So some of the financing mechanisms are just very foreign to a lot of our tribal members. That's not to say we couldn't get there, but I recall conversations with AHFC back when they had weatherization funds, and folks were like, well, how can we get these funds out to rural Alaska? And all the little challenges just kind of stack up. One of them was just having X number of homes to justify an energy rater going out there. Because if your energy rater is driving down to, even from Anchorage to Palmer, well, that's not that bad, right? That's a couple hours worth of time. If you're taking a flight from Fairbanks to Galena, that's $500 round trip. And so at a minimum, you're probably looking at an overnight. So all those little costs start to stack up. And we see that even with trying to get mechanics and skilled tradesmen out to these places. So, I think Chris alluded to it, but there's just some differences between urban and rural Alaska. And a lot of them, I think, were laid bare in the weatherization days. And so there's got to be a couple different scenarios if we truly want to make these opportunities available for residents across the state. And some of them need to just be aware and kind of be focused at some of the unique aspects of life in rural Alaska. But I will say, sorry to add to your question about the green bank and what different entities or how different tribes can take advantage of some of these tax credits. Right now, we've got a community out in Galena that's received a federal grant for X amount of dollars to do a large solar project. And TCC has kind of come in and say, hey guys, we'll de-risk this for you. Here's a basically zero interest loan of $1 million, because we know from our standpoint, from TCC's standpoint, that's de-risk. That's pretty solid money that once they place this solar array in service, if we help them fill out the paperwork, they're going to get the money back. They're going to pay back the loan. You try to take that to a bank, well, they're going to have to get their loan folks all spooled up on these tax credits, and they're going to have to go through all the financial statements of the tribe out in Galena, and that loan probably just won't happen. So, there's going to be a bunch of different opportunities for a green bank to benefit, whether they're private individuals looking to put solar on their homes that can bundle loans, like Chris pointed out, or communities. And right now, the market for those loans is really kind of non-existent. Chris's example of banks being perfectly willing to provide zero interest loans to depreciating assets, which are all of the new vehicles that people purchase, is really appropriate, because I look at solar PV as something that's going to be around providing benefit to the end user with very little maintenance and saving them money that they can use for loan repayments for 20 years. That's a pretty secure financing stream. But if your finance industry isn't spooled up to understand that, then it doesn't mean nearly as much. So I just really agree. This is a very unique opportunity, especially with all the potential for capital, or at least assistance setting up this sort of model in the state of Alaska. The opportunity is tremendous, and it's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. If we miss it, it might not come around again.
I think that's maybe I'm frozen, maybe I'm not. Hopefully you can hear me. I think that's an important point to perhaps end on. We've got some time left here for a few just related to programs that are available to renters or folks who don't, own their rooftop, for example, for rooftop solar, and things like that. So questions, just Chris, if you're aware of examples of green bank programs that are available to renters or folks who don't own their buildings.
I am not off the top of my head. I think that is something that could be developed potentially, but the question is who, from, especially when you're thinking about leveraging private capital, you have to remember that if you want private capital to be involved, their immediate thing is going to be what's the risk involved. And so none of these programs is going to be one size fits all. That's why we have to have different kinds of programs. I am very aware of low income solar programs, but I don't necessarily think those are ones that need virtual net metering, which is kind of what you're talking about. If you don't own the roof, then it's virtual net metering. So I think that gets fairly complicated, probably from a risk point of view.
Got it. And then there is a question here, just where would community solar projects fall in the priority ranking for Alaska's proposed green bank? You sort of spoke to that, Dave, and it sort of sounds like that's like sort of an overlap between the green bank and then also this solar for all funding. So I'm curious just to sort of have you rehash your thoughts on community solar as it fits into this puzzle here.
Yeah, I mean, I think community solar from a purely like economic standpoint, right? The nuts and bolts. I mean, it drives me it drives me nuts as somebody who's been installing solar for a while, to go up and run on some of the trails by my house in Fairbanks and see people that there's a tree right here and they've installed a solar panel right here. I'm just like, why did we do that? But people want to make an impact. They want to put solar on their homes. And even if it's a less than optimal site, well, shoot, I've got some funding and there's a tax credit and I want to have an impact on my power consumption. So they'll put solar on their building. In a perfect world, you would have the ability for those families, those folks that own their homes or pay an electric bill just in general, to purchase a share, just like you would a stock of a system that's at an optimal angle and an optimal site. Somebody can go through and handle the maintenance on it, clear snow. All those things kind of get bundled in an easy package, and you can just put money down, and then that system puts electricity onto the grid, and you're simply kind of debiting it in one area and one bill, or one meter, I should say, and crediting it on another meter. All of the, I don't know, the mechanics of that make perfect sound sense. The challenge is simply what the tariffs currently allow and what the Regulatory Commission of Alaska currently allows. But the technical side of it is very clean, very straightforward, and I think it makes a heck of a lot more sense. Not to mention some of the changes with weather patterns that we're seeing. And I think you guys are dealing with 30 inches of snow or something like that down in Anchorage. We've got nice, light, fluffy snow in Fairbanks, but we've seen a little more of it lately. And you get a pipeline era home that's already maybe not built to the correct standards. You're putting, a couple pounds per square foot worth of solar on it. If you don't have any other option, by putting a residential scale system on it. If you had a community solar option, there's just a lot of reasons why it might be a better alternative, and the green bank provides a really clean way to fit in there and assist with financing on it.
Thanks. Well, I will note that we have 3 minutes left here, and I have some closing remarks to share, but I would encourage you both to sort of maybe wrap us up with some final remarks here, and sort of the importance not only of this green bank effort and the solar for all funding, but sort of the moment and the context that we're in, and sort of taking advantage of all these opportunities together to really maximize those benefits for Alaskans. I'll just say too, I've really appreciated these questions and answers. There's many that we didn't answer, and that's just sort of the nature of these webinars, although I think it's also just inspiration for continued conversation with our speakers. So I appreciate all the questions, but would hope that you stay engaged with this topic and we can share some resources. But Dave and Chris, any final remarks on the importance of these efforts and sort of how they combine to really provide us with opportunities to take advantage of here in Alaska?
Well, I can say that we're cooking the gas crisis right now, and we've had other webinars about that. We are looking at at least 50-60% higher gas prices that we use. That's the fuel we use to make electricity for 3 of the 4 co-ops in the rail belt. It's the fuel we use for heating in much of the state of Alaska. And if we can take advantage of these new technologies that are out there, that not necessarily new, but always improving technologies like heat pumps, like solar, like just basic weatherization and energy efficiency, and a more rapid basis because we have affordable financing for it. It's really important. And so getting a green bank established and then making that connection between a state green bank and the federal funding is crucial, I think.
Yeah, and I'll just add to this, this is it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And Chris, fortunately, has been after this, and REAP has been after this green bank concept for many years. So I think in many ways we're a step ahead of other states, and I really applaud REAP for that. And I think the state's really lucky to have an entity like REAP that's moving some of these conversations forward. But just in general, I think, anybody that's involved with renewable energy in the state is kind of interested in it for the same reasons that Chris just mentioned. We're all kind of looking towards the future, looking for ways to produce energy that are different than how we've been doing them as a state in the past, less carbon intensive and hopefully lower cost in the long term. So that's the goal right now, is just to take advantage of all these federal funding opportunities and try to bring as many of these dollars to bear in Alaska as we can, because they're going to keep benefiting us for many years to come.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Dave and Chris, for joining us today. Thank you all in the audience here for sticking with us throughout this whole webinar. It is 1 on the dot. Promise we'd end on time. We're doing that right here, right now. We'll follow up with the resources. We do have one more webinar in this series coming up in a few weeks' time, so keep an eye out for that. But finally, wanted to thank our sponsors, Messier and Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, for making this webinar series possible. I really appreciate your engagement and support, and really excited to continue the conversation. But we'll let you all go, and we hope to see you in a few weeks' time. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, John.